Hey MMA fans, Cage Minds, your host Mika Frankel, talking about the news today. We're going to bring everyone up to date with all the news happenings in the MMA world. So let's get right to it. We'll start off talking about Bellator. What's the big news with Bellator? Bellator has signed a big heavyweight. Rodgers, troubled heavyweight. We all know him from Strikeforce. Started off his career 10-0. Since then, one win, 4 losses, no draws, 1 no contest. He is going to get a chance to be in the next Bellator heavyweight tournament, or at least have a qualifying match for that. He will debut Bellator 71, June 22nd. No opponent name yet, but most likely that will be a heavyweight qualifier. Also, other Bellator heavyweight news. Heavyweight Bellagio Ivanov, who was in the last Bellator heavyweight tournament, but had to pull out, being stabbed back in his home country. He is now fully recovered and out of the hospital. That's good news for Bellagio. Move on to some other Bellator news. Bellator 72, that will take place July 21st, has been announced with its main event and co-main event. The feature fight will be Bryan the Beast Baker versus Karl the Psycho Amoussou for the Season 6 Welterweight Championship and a chance to be the #1 contender and take on Ben Askren. Also, the co-main event, or at least the other bout to this time that has been named, will be the 3rd installment of the Joachim Spirit Wolf versus Maurice Romskis happenings. Can't really call it a trilogy of fights. This will be the 3rd time they're meeting. Hopefully for once we'll get to see a full fight. So that's the Bellator news for this week. Now we're going to move on to ONE FC news. Their next event is going to be June 23rd. It is Dynasty of the Warrior. It was supposed to be headlined by Phil Baroni versus Roger Huerta, but Phil Baroni took a fight at Ring of Fire 43 2 weekends ago against Chris Holland and got TKO'd. So what does that mean? Being TKO'd, the head injury is the big concern about that. You can't fight 3 weeks later, so he has been pulled from the ONE FC event. Roger Huerta will be left on, and to the best of my knowledge right now, Renato Babalo Sobral, who has a 36-9 record, who is taking on Tetsuya Mizuno, who is 11-7, will now be the feature attraction to that event. Also, ONE FC news. AMC Pancration leader, ONE FC official, and also rules organizer Matt Hume had some amendments to the rules that they discussed this week. ONE FC is now going to allow the 6 to 12 elbows that are illegal in the unified rules of mixed martial arts, are also going to allow knees to the ground to a down opponent, and it will also, instead of a 10-point must scoring system, will now turn to the old Pride rules where all 3 rounds is graded just as one fight as a whole who won. I'm excited to see those rule changes, and again, everyone, it's going to be June 23rd. Check out ONE FC's next event to see how the rule changes affect the action. Now we'll move on to the UFC news for the week. Biggest news from the UFC, the video game deal. They have stopped working with THQ. That deal is over. The Undisputed series, from what we, best of our knowledge, is probably done with. And now the UFC has teamed up with EA Sports, the same people that make the John Madden series, to make a UFC game. So that has all gamers in high anticipation of what will come from that relationship. Move on to some news of fights that were going on. UFC on Fuel 4. We were to see the welterweight debut of Aaron Simpson versus John Finch. John Finch pulled out last week with an undisclosed injury. This week it is disclosed. He has a partially torn ACL. Hopefully some physical therapy, some rehab without surgery. John Finch will be back. And Kenny Robertson, who last time in the Octagon competed at UFC 126, losing to Mike Pierce, will now get redemption, his next try at the Octagon, as he will be the replacement to take on Aaron Simpson at that Fuel 4 event. Moving on to some UFC 149 news. Dream Champion Bibano Fernandez has joined the company and will take on tough alum Roland Delorme, who's on a 2-fight winning streak since coming off the show. And a fight that has had some twists and turns taken to it was one of the first fights announced for UFC 149, Thiago Alves versus Yoshihiro Akiyama. Akiyama was injured, dropped out. Seir Bahadrzada now stepped in to face Thiago Alves. Alves is now injured, and Chris Clements will step in and take on him. So we now end up with Chris Clements versus Siver Baharzada. Both men came off of very impressive striking debuts. This should be a fun fight to watch. Moving on now to some UFC 150 news. Nick Lentz will take on Iji Mitsuoka. That fight is set for UFC 150. Also, Dennis Bermudez versus Tommy Hayden. And a middleweight bout between Michael Kumpler and Jared Hamman will also take place at UFC 150. UFC 151 news. A featherweight war has been scheduled between Dennis Siver and Eddie Yagin. That's great to hear. And then coming off of his UFC 145 knockout victory over Miguel Angel Torres, Michael Mayday Mcdonald has inked a new 4-fight deal with the UFC, keeping the young talent in the octagon for a long time to come. Also, now on to less than great news for some fighters. The axe came down today in the UFC, and such names as Steve Cantwell, Kamal Shalrous, Jorge Lopez, Jeff Curran, Aaron Rosa, Dongyi Yang, Efrain Escudero, Mike Massenzio, Eric Wisley, and Alex Soto have all been released from the UFC, making regional promoters salivate over the chance of having these former UFC competitors headline their cards. Look for them to be at a card near you soon. This has been Cage Minds, trying to keep everybody up on the news for the beginning of June. This has been Cage Minds. Hit us up on Facebook, Twitter, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Leave us a comment, uncage the warrior within yourself, and thank you for watching.